Serving the community.
Teddy Burton is here. Good morning, Teddy Burton.
Good morning, my brother. Good morning, Gloucester.
Okay, Mr. Teddy Burton, do I need to read the statement out again just to keep people in... I know you're on top of it, sir, you know, because I know you're on top... we have a man with a legal mind here, you know, so I'm going to mind my P's and Q's and everything here. Right. David Starkey, he said in his interview on Newsnight, I'm just recapping, Gloucester, what has happened is the substantial section of the chavs he wrote about have become blacks, the white have become blacks. A particular sort of violent, destructive, nihilistic gangster culture has become the fashion, he said. Black and white, boy and girl operate in this language together, this language which is wholly false, which is this Jamaican patois which has intruded in England, which is why so many of us have this sense of literally a foreign country. And then he described, if you listen to David Lammy, that he sounds white. Basically, that rounds up his comments there. Mr. Teddy Burton, sir, what would you like to say? You tackle it any way you want to, brother. I know you've got your things there written down, and you're gonna bless us this morning.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, my brother, for having me on. But I'd like to, before I say anything else, emphasize that anything I say hereafter is not to be construed as some kind of slur on the white population in any way, because I am mindful that David Starkey's comments are not representative of the majority of white people in this country. And indeed, many of them have roundly condemned him for the things that he has said. So whatever I say is to be taken as trying to set the record straight rather than seeking to attack anyone. You know, the comments which were made by David Starkey are those which emanate from a kind of perverse mind and normally would not even necessitate any kind of response, except for the fact that this man is supposed to be a historian with some sort of influence, and that's why we can't allow him to get away with this, because he's in a position of influence, and therefore we have to address those comments he has made. First of all, what I'd like to say is, David Starkey's comments talking about a profound cultural change and then going on to link that to the Jamaican patois, which according to him leads us to feel as if we are in a foreign country. By making statements like those, he is suggesting that there is something of a pure English culture. Well, if he had done his job properly as an historian, he would realize that there's no such thing as a pure English culture. English culture is a fusion, a synthesis of all the cultures that have, of peoples who have graced the shores of these islands, and also of those persons, of those countries, nations, races that Britain through empire has encountered. Let's take, for example, the quintessentially English tradition of drinking tea. Your tea comes from Kenya, your sugar for the tea comes from the Caribbean, and the bone china in which it is had, from which it is had, is called bone china for a reason. So there is no such thing as a pure English culture, and he's implying that, you know, Jamaicans who in large numbers came after the Windrush, we are the ones who came here and disrupted heretofore pure English culture. There was no such thing. We know of the Norman conquest, which happened in 1066, but black people were in England before that, influencing British culture in significant ways. If we think about Septimus Severus, for example, who was a black Roman emperor, he died and was buried in York, right, in the north of England. He did extensive work on Hadrian's Wall and gave Britain decades of peace. He was very influential right here in this country. He was the emperor ruling Britain at the time. We can think of Queen Philippa, for example, who was a black queen and who ruled in the absence of her husband right here in England. And I have come across something that says Queen Philippa was a remarkable woman. She's famed as having been very wise and was very well known and loved by the English for her kindness and for her restraint. Now, if black culture is supposed to be this nihilistic, violent gangster culture, how is it that the British people would have appreciated Queen Philippa, who was also black and therefore, by extension, should have been subject to that culture? How is it that she is famed in history to have been wise, known and loved by the English people for her kindness and her restraint? I mean, I think Starkey's comments are just flatly ridiculous, and you know, it beggars belief that this man is anything of an historian. If that's the best we can do for an historian, then we're all doomed. So first of all, there's nothing of any so-called pure English culture, and neither is there anything of a homogeneous black culture either. If we think about the black community, there are so many nations around this world whose populations are predominantly black. Let's take Nigeria, Africa's most populous black country. Nigeria has approximately 250 ethnic groups, if you want to put them in those terms. Perhaps not strictly speaking ethnic, but they have these subgroups within their culture. And many of these also have their own language. Now, are you going to tell me that if we were to take just Nigeria, let alone all the other black populations of the world, that there's just one culture running through all of us, and that culture is a culture of violence and, you know, something which is nihilistic? That is utterly ridiculous. There's not a homogeneous black culture. But if we were to even take that further, let's think about Mary Seacole in the Crimean War. Mary Seacole was a black woman, right? This woman suffered institutional prejudice at the time when all she wanted to do was to help suffering soldiers. Mary Seacole had nothing to do with the decisions that led to the Crimean War. You might say that it is those who are of a nihilistic mindset who led to war. But she wasn't there to further the war. She was there to help people, right? Let's think of our current times. I don't see any black persons there making the decisions to go into what many people call an illegal war in Iraq. Those, you might say, were the ones who are of a nihilistic mindset, a destructive kind of culture. No black person was there making those decisions. Yet I see a black president being the main voice and the one with the greatest influence deciding to bring this illegal, unjust war to an end and return troops from his country home. And therefore, he's leading the world in making this decision. Now, we could go on and on and on, and we could make this appear as if it's a tit-for-tat kind of thing, which is not my intention, but I'm simply raising these examples to show how ridiculous a statement this man has made. But the second thing I'd like to address is the whole issue of his attack on Patois. Again, one wonders whether this man is truly an historian, because if you look at the history of Patois, Patois came into existence because at the time when Africans were brought into the United States and into the Caribbean from Africa, they were separated from their groups, their tribes that they came from Africa in, that they belonged to in Africa. And they were separated down to the very families that they belonged to. They wanted to cut the slave masters wanted to cut every single communal associations that these slaves had. Everything that gave them some sense of community they wanted to destroy. And one of the main reasons for wanting to do that was that they wanted to prevent any chance of any rebellion fomenting against the slave masters. That is why they separated them so much. Therefore, if you don't have a common language to communicate to the next guy in, the chances of you planning rebellions against your masters is literally zero. Now, despite that, these Africans, using words from their own African languages and using broken forms of the English language, came up with an absolutely new language and still were able to frustrate the efforts of these slave masters. They were still able to plan rebellions. They were still able to do all sorts of passive resistances against these men, despite all the efforts of these oppressors to prevent them from communicating with each other. Now, if people in those circumstances can create a new language and still communicate when everything that they knew before was ripped away from them, the listeners to this program will make their own decision whether that represents a nihilistic, gangster, violent culture or whether that is the stuff of genius. I know where I come down on, what side of that argument I come down on. Because frankly, I cannot see how we can say that Patois is a false language. Now, people who have studied the language far more extensively than Mr. Starkey has done, they have come to the conclusion that Patois has all the elements of a language. It has its own lexicon, its own grammar, its own syntax. It has all the elements that a language should have. So there's nothing false about Patois. But let's extend that argument further. We know that English language is derived from a plethora of other languages, largely from Latin and even from Arabic. Now, does that mean that English is a false language? If the definition of a false language is that it is derived from other languages and it is fused from different parts, it is eclectic, does that mean then, doesn't it follow that English would therefore be a false language? Now, I'm not suggesting that it is, but I'm simply showing that Mr. Starkey's argument does not stand up to scrutiny. Now, if it is the Jamaican patois which has led to this kind of protest or this decline in British culture, I am rather shocked that us as Jamaicans have so much power here in the UK, because it is my experience that as a minority group in the UK, we have been struggling to get our voices heard. So it seems rather strange to me that we have always had such extensive power and did not realize it. Let me tell you something. Having worked with young people in London for years, I have come across young people speaking in ways that I cannot understand a word. Now, I am a native patois speaker. Right? And if I can't understand what some of these young people are saying, it is not English, it is not patois, then I really fail to understand how it is the Jamaican patois which is causing the decline in British culture. What David Starkey does not understand is that youth culture is not something which is static. Youth culture is influenced by all sorts of factors, and it doesn't stay one place. What youth culture was in the 70s is not what youth culture is today. It is not something static. It is influenced by various things at different times. So I really think that, for us as black people, we have nothing really to be ashamed of. This is not a black riot. If we look at our television pictures, we will see that this was a mixture of people from all backgrounds. This was not a black riot. And this is not representative of black culture. There is a variety of black cultures, if you will, and I am not aware of any of them being nihilistic or gangster or whatever. That is not to deny that you have criminals within the black community, but that is not exclusive to the black community. Was Hitler black? I fail to think so. Was his henchmen black? No, they weren't. Is Slobodan Milosevic black? No. Some of these guys who perpetrated the most heinous evils and crimes upon the human race were not black. And yet we are hearing that this is what our culture represents, something nihilistic and destructive. I think that for those of us who are black people and hearing these comments, what we need to be doing is saying to our children, we need to reaffirm who we are and say to our children, look, this is not the kind of source that you let define you. You need to understand that black history existed before the centuries in which slavery started. We need to look back at the great civilizations of Africa, which predated great, if you may call it, great British civilization. Our civilizations as black people in Africa predated the British Empire. And, I read of one king called Mansa Musa, who when he visited Egypt, he gave away so much gold. This man was from the kingdom of Mali. He gave away so much gold that money lost its value in Egypt at the time. because he was so wealthy and his kingdom was so powerful. So we need to go and reaffirm who we are by looking at our history and not looking at history from the perspective of Victor's history, so to speak, of the sort that David Starkey is promulgating. We need to go and find our history written by African authors who understand, and not just African authors, but authors which are of an objective mindset rather than having a very short-term agenda to promote. And we need to be saying to our kids, this is truly who you are. You are not represented by what happened on the streets of London and other parts of the country the other day, because that did not represent any particular racial group. So I think, I have gone on for quite a while now, and I really think we can conclude on this, that at best, David Starkey's comments were idiotic, and they might even be worse than that and be representing, a very kind of racist point of view. But I think that he has egregiously misjudged the sense that is out there in the population. He thought that he would be safe coming out with these kind of remarks because people were angry. But people weren't angry at black people. People were angry at criminals who were burning down their businesses and looting their shops and so on. Angry at whoever these perpetrators were. He has seriously misjudged that and thought that he could come out into the open with these kind of ridiculous comments, which clearly he was harboring before. But thank God that the British people have shown themselves to be way above this kind of mindset and have moved along in great leaps and bounds as a society. And therefore, we can conclude that his remarks represent those who are of a perverse kind of mindset and thank God are still in the minority in this country.
Serving the community.